Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I've been sitting in this morning obviously because I'm reined in with the hurricane a bit, so I've been reading through social media, reading through studies, and I came across an interesting statement with Dr. Mike Israetel, so let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a bit, and let's talk about this, because this is something that's come up a lot on this channel, come up between me and debates with other channels, things that are going on out there, and a lot of people keep trying to say that the rack pull is superior trapezius development exercise for building your traps up. And a lot of people are giving anecdotal evidence saying, well, I've seen guys over the years do it. I personally haven't. I've never seen it happen. And that's just my own observation versus other people's observations. Well, Dr. Mike made a statement, which I'll flip in here, discussing some of this. And for those who don't know, he's an interesting person. I do follow his work. I don't necessarily agree with everything that he says, but I do follow his work, and he's probably a better authority on muscle growth than most of the people out there. And the reason I say that is because he's a professor of exercise science. That's what he does for a living. He's a professor of exercise science. All right, and now before people say, well, he's just some, pencil neck geek or whatever, he's also a competitive bodybuilder, and he also competes in jiu-jitsu. All right, so he competes in an actual contact sport, competes in bodybuilding, and he's a professor of kinesiology. So he's got a personal vested interest in this. Like, muscle growth is actually something that matters to him professionally and personally, and he's got the credentials. He's got the PhD in the field. He's got the experience in the field, and he's standing here telling people, actually, no, shrugs are superior. And you know what, guys, haven't I said the same thing? I've tried to tell you guys, if you want really bigger traps, if for whatever reason traps are a big priority for you, even though the internet says traps are gay, according to some memes I saw, if that's your goal, you're like, I really want my traps to grow, why wouldn't you do shrugs? Why wouldn't you do shrugs? Now, the point he makes is that, yes, static stretching exercises do have their own independent growth, meaning it's a form of growth stimulation, but there's no data out there suggesting that the amount of static stretching that you could do with heavy loaded stretches is going to equal or surpass conventional full range of motion training. It can stimulate growth, but again, there's no actual evidence anywhere so far suggesting that it's a superior growth mechanism, and if anything, it's going to produce less growth. In other words, static stretching of your traps can stimulate growth. It can make them bigger, but it's not going to be able to equal or quite equal what doing real shrugs would do. The other factor that he throws in there is the one about overall recovery. Overall recovery, and that's kind of another big point. And I'm all for doing big compounds that work multiple muscles, but you've got to pick and choose your battles. You have to pick and choose your battles with your volume of training, with your recovery, hypertrophy, and everything else. The fact of the matter is, relatively heavy shrugs are not going to interfere with the recovery of the body, the overall body, as much as a rack pull. I'm a big fan of the deadlift. Everyone knows it. I'm a big fan of using axial loading exercises in general, exercises where you're on your feet, where your spine gets compressed. I'm a big fan. It's also well understood in all the scientific literature that they also are the most difficult to recover from. One of the reasons a lot of coaches don't like the deadlift is my favorite exercise, the conventional deadlift, deficit deadlifts, things like that. I think that is one of the best exercises in the world. That is a point of contention. Anyone know why? Not that it doesn't stimulate tremendous amount of muscle growth. The argument made is that recovery from the exercise, particularly when workloads start going relatively high on the deadlift, recovery from it can be difficult enough that it might overshadow the muscle gains versus if you had done other exercises to stimulate all those muscles. In other words, deadlift is a fantastic exercise, but if you really want to get the most total training volume in to stimulate the most muscle growth, you might need to actually limit the volume of your deadlift unless you also care very much about the strength on your deadlift, meaning it needs to be multi-purpose in nature. If your only goal is to gain muscle as quickly as possible, high volume deadlifting isn't the best way to do it because of the impact on recovery. It can affect your ability to train your entire body, your peripheral nervous system, your spine. Everything gets so fatigued that it might interfere with your overall training and cause, in theory, slightly less muscle growth in a worst case scenario. But if you care about getting your deadlift strong on top of it, it may be worth it to you. And that's the counter argument made by people who aren't big fans of using the deadlift for hypertrophy. Now here's where we're about to go with this. People are like, well, the rack pull. The rack pull is more difficult to recover from than the deadlift, right? For obvious reasons. For obvious reasons. What are those reasons? The additional axial loading. In other words, when you start rack pulling above the knee, it's not uncommon to take your 1 rep max on the deadlift and add 300, 400 or more pounds to it for reps. In other words, like when I mess with rack pulls above the knee, and I don't mean the stuff people are doing on the internet where they pull the weight 2 inches. I'm talking about just above the knee, to where you still have to move the bar like 6 to 8 inches. It actually lifts 6 to 8 inches off the pins. A real above the knee rack pull, not this little even shorter version people are doing. At the time, I tried to mess with some many years ago. We're talking 15 years ago here. All right, so people say, why don't you have a video footage? Because no one had smartphones. Smartphones didn't exist. But at the time, I was deadlifting a little over 600. Not much over 600 for a max. My max was probably 625-ish, 630-ish, something in that range. But I was able to do the above the knee rack pulls, and I only did them for a short time, and I quit doing them. I realized they weren't helping me in any way. It was almost a worthless exercise, and I quit doing it. I'm shocked that it keeps coming back in vogue. I was able to do 5 reps with 725, with straps, of course. 5 reps with 725. So I was able to take roughly my max, at least a training max, add 100 pounds to it and do 5 reps. I didn't see any additional development. I did them for about 6 weeks. I didn't see any benefits. If anything, they were fatiguing me, and I quit. So you guys get the idea. And there's also people out there, I mean, who are doing 500 pounds over their max with these really short range of motion rack pulls. So when you think of that in terms of axial loading, how much extra weight is being loaded on the spine? In my case, being able to do doubles with about 600 for work sets, or 3 or 4 reps with like 585 at the time, right? My work sets. Going to 725 for 5. That's more reps with over 100 pounds or more weight added. That's extra axial loading, extra compression of the spine. That impacts recovery tremendously through your entire body, through your peripheral nervous system. So what you're doing is using something that does stimulate the traps. No one's arguing that it doesn't. When you think about the amount of volume that you can put in using a much lighter weight, because someone who can do rack pulls for work sets with 700 pounds can probably shrug 315 for work sets for 8 to 10 reps, right? I think that's reasonable. Much less axial loading. In other words, you can do a lot more volume for your traps without impacting your overall recovery that much in comparison. So in other words, the full range of motion shrug, because you have to use a lighter weight to do a full range of motion shrug versus even a little cheat shrug, because the full range of motion forces you to use a lighter weight, you end up having a lot less compression on the spine. You have a lot less recovery issues. You have a lot less fatigue of the peripheral nervous system. So if your goal was purely hypertrophy of the traps, you'd be able to put in more workload before you overreached. Well, more workload usually equals more hypertrophy. Now, and it's not linear. It doesn't mean if you double your workload, you're going to double your gains. Sometimes when you double your workload, you might increase your muscle gains by 1%, 2%. But doesn't it make more sense to use an exercise that you can do a lot more volume on, that still works your core, it still works stabilizers? The shrug isn't a terrible exercise by any means, versus doing these heavy rack pulls that break your body down. I feel that they're dangerous to the spine, and I'm someone who believes the deadlift is great, but the difference is that the amount of axial loading is really excessive on a lot of rack pulls. It's not something you should be doing regularly. I think it does lead to injuries. I think it will lead to herniated disc. But the difference here in recovery versus the volume and the stimulation you could subject your traps to versus the recovery, they're not comparable. The shrug is going to be a vastly superior exercise. And you guys saw Dr. Mike's statement there. And again, this is someone who is a legitimate expert, professor, PhD, competitive bodybuilder, competitive athlete, who's standing here saying, look, it should just almost be common sense that the shrug is going to be a better trap building exercise than the rack pull. I don't get the impression that he's a big fan of the rack pull in any way. He might be somewhere, but I'm not aware of it. But again, this is an example of someone saying, no, it shouldn't be as good of a trap exercise. There's no reason to think that it is. So people need to think about that when they think about their anecdotal observations out there. A few people are like, well, I've seen it. Well, I haven't. And I've been in this culture for 20 plus years. I've never seen it. I've never seen anyone make these amazing gains off the rack pulls in person that I knew personally. I've never seen it happen. Again, be careful what you observe on the internet. You might have known people who have, and that's okay. But that's not been my experience, and it's certainly not the experience of what any true experts out here are actually saying. They're saying, no, shrugs would be way better. What are you guys talking about? So put that in perspective. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.